The cruelest chains are the ones people stop noticing. Red dust drifted endlessly through the narrow streets of Blackstone Mining Colony, covering every rooftop, every rusted machine, and every tired face with the same dull color. The wind carried the bitter scent of crushed ore and hot metal across the settlement, while towering excavation rigs continued chewing slowly through the scarred mountains surrounding the colony. Somewhere beneath the constant rumble of drilling engines, an old warning siren echoed once before fading back into the endless rhythm of labor. Life in Blackstone rarely changed. Men left for the mines before sunrise. Freight trains arrived loaded with or before sunset. Nobody expected miracles. At the center of the settlement stood a weathered warehouse whose faded sign had long ago lost most of its lettering. Everyone simply called it the Exchange Hall. Officially, it handled surplus equipment, abandoned machinery, and reclaimed cargo. Unofficially, everyone knew desperate people sometimes appeared there too. Ryan Mitchell crossed the dusty square carrying a worn canvas bag over one shoulder. At 39 years old, the human miner looked exactly like someone who had spent half his life underground. Coal dust permanently stained the seams of his work jacket. His heavy boots carried fresh scratches from another 12-hour shift. Around his wrist rested an old mechanical watch that had belonged to his father, its cracked crystal carefully polished every Sunday despite the years. Ryan had come to the Exchange Hall for one reason only. His mining drill had finally failed beyond repair, and tomorrow's shift depended on finding affordable replacement parts. He stepped through the wide entrance where warm industrial lights illuminated rows of old equipment lined neatly across the concrete floor. Merchants inspected engines. Mechanics argued over spare components. Cargo handlers pushed heavy carts between stacks of metal crates. It looked like every ordinary auction Ryan had attended before. Then he heard the chain. Not loud. Just one soft metallic sound unlike everything else surrounding it. He turned instinctively. At the far end of the hall, beneath a raised auction platform illuminated by harsh white lights, a young alien woman stood quietly with her hands resting in front of her. A thin restraint of pale blue energy circled one wrist, connecting her to a polished restraint post beside the platform. She neither struggled nor lowered her head. She simply looked toward the floor with calm golden eyes that seemed far older than her youthful face. Her deep blue skin carried a faint shimmer beneath the lights, though exhaustion had dulled much of its natural brilliance. Long silver hair fell loosely across the shoulders of a worn gray coat, whose sleeves had been carefully repaired many times. Thin bioluminescent lines beneath her eyes glowed only faintly, almost disappearing each time she blinked. Around the platform, buyers studied data screens listing measurements, health reports, and legal classifications as though reading specifications for mining machinery instead of looking at another living person. Ryan never read the display. He found himself watching only her face. She never once looked toward the crowd. She never asked anyone for help. Somewhere behind him, the auctioneer adjusted his microphone. Next item, the amplified voice announced smoothly. Recovered under Outer Rim Commercial Reclamation Statute. Several buyers raised numbered paddles before the bidding had even begun. Ryan frowned. Something inside his chest tightened in a way he could not explain. Around him, conversations continued normally. People discussed market prices, or shipments, fuel contracts. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. That unsettled him more than the platform itself. He slowly glanced down at the canvas bag resting against his leg. Inside lay nearly every credit he had saved over the past year, enough to replace his mining drill and keep working through another harsh season. Without those savings, tomorrow would become very difficult. The auctioneer lifted one hand. Opening bid. The blue restraint shimmered softly as the young alien woman finally raised her eyes for the first time. Across the crowded hall, her gaze met Ryan's for only a single heartbeat. There was no pleading in it, no anger, only the quiet expression of someone who had already accepted that freedom now belonged to whoever could afford it. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the exchange hall with practiced confidence, rising above the constant hum of machinery and the distant vibration of freight elevators carrying or toward the surface. Opening bid, 2,000 credits. A merchant wearing polished mining boots immediately raised his numbered paddle without even looking at the young alien woman. 2,000. Another voice answered from somewhere behind Ryan. 2,200. The numbers climbed with mechanical precision, spoken as casually as prices for replacement engines or cargo loaders. Ryan stood motionless near the rear of the crowd, his canvas bag still hanging from one shoulder. Inside rested every credit he had managed to save after years of double shifts beneath the mountains. He had counted the money twice before leaving home that morning. Enough for a replacement drill. Enough to keep earning a living. Not enough for mistakes. Yet his attention never returned to the worn mining equipment lined along the opposite side of the hall. It remained fixed on the young woman standing quietly beneath the harsh auction lights. She never reacted when each new bid echoed across the room. She neither pleaded nor resisted. The restraint around her wrist glowed with a pale blue light that pulsed gently every few seconds, more like a reminder than a punishment. Ryan found that almost harder to watch. Nearby buyers discussed extraction permits and fuel contracts while waiting for the auction to end. One older merchant leaned toward another and whispered, "Strong build. Healthy. She should work well in refinery operations." His companion nodded thoughtfully without lowering his catalog. Ryan looked away before the conversation could continue. Something about the entire room suddenly felt colder than the red desert waiting outside. The bidding climbed again. 3,000. 3,400. 3,800. The auctioneer smiled politely after every increase, his tone never changing. To him, this was another ordinary business transaction. Ryan slowly tightened his hand around the strap of the canvas bag. His father's old watch rested against his wrist beneath the sleeve of his jacket. Without thinking, he rubbed one thumb across the cracked crystal the same way he had done since inheriting it years earlier. The watch had stopped working long ago, yet he still wore it every day because some things deserved to be carried even after they no longer measured time. The thought lingered unexpectedly. Some things deserve to be carried. The young alien woman finally looked toward the audience again. Her golden eyes drifted quietly across the rows of bidders without stopping on any particular face. There was no accusation in them, no expectation, only the exhausted calm of someone who had already accepted whatever tomorrow intended to become. Ryan wondered when a person stopped expecting rescue. The auctioneer checked his display terminal. Current bid, 4,200 credits. He looked around the room. Any higher? A brief silence settled over the hall. Several merchants quietly calculated potential profits. One man lowered his paddle after shaking his head. Apparently, the investment no longer seemed worthwhile. Ryan looked down at the canvas bag once more. Then he thought about another morning underground when his father had shared the last piece of bread with an injured coworker instead of eating it himself. Ryan had asked why. His father had simply smiled and answered, "Tools help you make a living. Character helps you keep one worth living." Ryan never forgot those words. Before he could stop himself, his hand slowly rose into the air. The numbered paddle felt strangely heavy in his grip. The auctioneer immediately noticed. 4,500. Several heads turned toward the tired miner standing quietly near the back of the room. A few buyers looked surprised. Others simply amused. One merchant laughed softly. "That miner cannot afford this." Ryan ignored him. His eyes remained on the young woman beneath the lights. For the first time since entering the hall, something changed in her expression. It was almost impossible to see. Not hope. She had traveled too far beyond hope for that. It was recognition. Someone, at last, was looking at her instead of the price beside her name. Silence settled across the exchange hall after Ryan's bid. It lasted only a heartbeat, yet somehow felt longer than the years etched into the tired faces surrounding the auction platform. The auctioneer glanced toward the rear of the room, clearly surprised to find the newest bidder standing in worn mining boots instead of expensive business attire. 4,500 credits, he repeated. "Do I hear 47? One of the merchants who had been bidding earlier laughed quietly without raising his paddle. "Let the miner have his charity project." Another shrugged and returned his attention to the equipment catalog. Profit had disappeared from the transaction. Interest quickly followed. The auctioneer waited several more seconds before lifting the wooden hammer. 4,500 going once. Ryan barely heard the words. His thoughts remained fixed on the young alien woman standing beneath the harsh white lights. She had not smiled. She had not relaxed. She simply continued watching him with cautious disbelief, as though experience had taught her that hope often arrived disguised as another disappointment. Going twice. The hall remained silent. Finally, the hammer struck the wooden block with one clean sound. Sold. The sharp crack echoed through the warehouse before disappearing beneath the distant rumble of or conveyors outside. A clerk immediately approached Ryan carrying a payment terminal and several digital authorization forms. Congratulations, the man said automatically, speaking with the same detached tone used for machinery purchases. Transfer confirmation required. Ryan quietly removed the small stack of carefully folded credit certificates from inside his canvas bag. His fingers hesitated only briefly before placing them on the counter. Years of overtime disappeared in a single transaction. The clerk counted every certificate twice before nodding. Payment accepted. He handed Ryan a small electronic ownership tablet. Ryan looked at the screen only long enough to find the line he needed. Beside the words custodial transfer authorization appeared another option written in much smaller text. Immediate voluntary release. Without hesitation, he pressed it. The clerk frowned. Sir. Ryan looked up. Remove the restraint. The clerk blinked in confusion. You have not inspected the asset. Ryan quietly slid the tablet back across the counter. She is not an asset. The clerk looked uncertain for a moment before calling another attendant carrying a restraint control device. Together they approached the platform where the young alien woman remained standing exactly as before. The attendant entered several security codes. A soft electronic tone sounded. The pale blue restraint surrounding her wrist slowly dissolved into tiny points of fading light before disappearing completely. For the first time in who knew how long, nothing connected her to the platform anymore. Yet she did not move. She simply stared at her now empty wrist as though freedom itself had become unfamiliar. Ryan stepped onto the platform carefully, stopping several feet away so she would not feel cornered. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a small printed release certificate the clerk had provided moments earlier. He held it toward her without crossing the remaining distance. This belongs to you, he said quietly. She looked at the document, but made no attempt to take it. I do not understand. Her voice was calm, though uncertainty rested beneath every word. Ryan waited patiently. Finally, she asked the question he suspected had been waiting inside her since the bidding ended. Where do you want me to go? Ryan looked at the open warehouse doors where red desert wind carried fresh dust through the afternoon sunlight. Then he looked back at her. Anywhere you choose. She searched his face carefully, almost expecting hidden conditions to appear between the words. You paid for me. Ryan gently shook his head. No. He placed the release certificate into her trembling hands. I paid so nobody else could. The paper rustled softly in the warm industrial air as she stared down at the single sentence confirming she was legally free. For several long moments, she said nothing at all. Then, with tears quietly gathering in her golden eyes, she whispered the first words nobody in that warehouse had expected to hear. I do not remember how to leave. Ryan remained standing on the platform while the noisy warehouse slowly returned to its ordinary routine around them. Merchants resumed discussing equipment prices. Cargo handlers pushed loaded carts toward waiting freight lifts. The auctioneer announced the next collection of reclaimed mining machinery as though nothing remarkable had happened only moments earlier. Yet for the young alien woman standing before him, the world had become strangely unfamiliar. The glowing restraint had disappeared from her wrist. The release document rested lightly between trembling fingers. Freedom had arrived. She simply no longer remembered what freedom required. Ryan glanced toward the wide warehouse doors where the afternoon sun illuminated the dusty streets beyond. You can leave whenever you are ready, he said gently. She looked toward the open doorway without taking a single step. I do not know where to go. Her quiet answer carried no self-pity, only simple honesty. Ryan nodded slowly. That makes sense. She studied him with growing confusion. Most people tell me I should already know. Ryan shrugged lightly. Most people have never had their choices taken away. She lowered her eyes to the release certificate once again. How long does this paper protect me? Ryan blinked. Protect you. Until someone stronger decides it does not matter anymore. The question settled heavily between them. Ryan realized she had not asked because she doubted the law. She asked because experience had taught her that laws often followed power instead of justice. He folded his arms thoughtfully before answering. I cannot promise what strangers will do. He smiled faintly. But I can promise nobody is taking you back through those doors today. For the first time, A tiny measure of tension disappeared from her shoulders. Not completely, just enough to allow her next breath to come a little easier. Together, they stepped down from the auction platform into the busy warehouse. People moved around them carrying tools, crates, and machinery without paying much attention. Ryan noticed she instinctively shifted aside every time someone walked nearby, making herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Habits learned through survival rarely disappeared in a single afternoon. As they reached the entrance, warm desert wind carried fine red dust across the stone walkway outside. Blackstone mining colony stretched before them beneath a sky washed pale by heat and drifting clouds. Tall extraction towers stood against distant mountains while freight trains slowly crossed elevated tracks loaded with dark ore. Workers filled the streets wearing heavy mining jackets streaked with red dust. Nobody looked particularly wealthy. Nobody looked particularly comfortable. Yet everyone seemed to know where they belonged. Alara remained motionless beneath the warehouse awning. Ryan noticed her eyes following people walking with quiet purpose toward homes, workshops, and cafes. They all know where they are going, she whispered. Ryan adjusted the canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. It felt strangely light now that his savings were gone. Usually, she looked at him. And you? He pointed toward the western edge of the colony where a narrow road climbed gently toward a line of modest wooden cottages overlooking the mine. I have a small cabin. She immediately stepped backward. I cannot go there. Ryan looked surprised. Why not? Because you already spent everything you had. Her voice remained calm but firm. I will not become another burden. Ryan smiled gently. You are not. She shook her head. You do not even know me. He considered that for a moment before quietly answering. I know enough. What do you know? He looked toward the fading mark where the energy restraint had rested around her wrist only minutes earlier. I know somebody convinced you that your freedom had a price. Their eyes met. I disagree. A gust of warm wind lifted loose strands of silver hair across her face. She slowly brushed them aside while holding the release document carefully against her chest. Then, after a long silence filled only by distant mining engines and the sound of dust moving across empty streets, she took her first completely voluntary step. Not away from him. Beside him. The road leading away from the exchange hall climbed gradually toward the western ridge where the noise of drilling machines softened into a distant rumble beneath the evening wind. Ryan walked at an unhurried pace, his worn canvas bag now nearly empty except for a lunch tin, a water bottle, and a pair of old work gloves. Alara remained a few careful steps beside him, never falling behind, yet never quite walking shoulder to shoulder. The release document rested safely inside the inner pocket of her repaired gray coat, while her eyes quietly studied everything around her as though seeing an ordinary street for the first time. Small wooden houses lined the dusty road. Laundry fluttered between porches. Children chased one another around piles of red stone, while tired miners returned home carrying dented helmets beneath their arms. Nobody stared at Alara for very long. Most people simply nodded politely before continuing with their own evening routines. She noticed every small gesture. They are not afraid of me, she said quietly. Ryan smiled faintly. Most people around here are too busy worrying about tomorrow's shift. She considered that answer before asking another question. Do they know where I came from? Probably not. Then why are they kind? Ryan looked toward a little girl waving at an elderly neighbor from across the street. Maybe because they are hoping someone would do the same for them if life ever became difficult. Alara remained silent after that. The idea seemed unfamiliar, almost fragile, as though she feared thinking about it too long might cause it to disappear. They eventually reached a modest wooden cabin resting near the edge of the colony where the red cliffs overlooked miles of winding rail tracks stretching toward the mines. The house was small but carefully maintained. Firewood stood stacked neatly beside the porch. A weathered rocking chair rested beneath the front window. Light smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney into the evening sky. Ryan climbed the 2 wooden steps before opening the front door. Warm air carrying the comforting scent of vegetable stew and fresh coffee welcomed them inside. Alara stopped at the entrance instead of crossing the threshold. Her golden eyes moved slowly across the little room. A wooden dining table polished by years of use. Books resting on uneven shelves. Mining helmets hanging beside the door. Family photographs displayed carefully above a brick fireplace. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive, everything loved. Ryan noticed she had not moved. "You can come in." She looked down at the floorboards. "May I?" The question caught him by surprise. "Of course." She hesitated again. Without asking anything in return, Ryan gently leaned his shoulder against the open doorway. "The only thing I expect is that you tell me if you are still hungry." A faint expression touched her face. Not disbelief anymore. Something quieter. Something closer to relief. She stepped inside with careful movements, almost afraid her boots might leave marks on the clean wooden floor. Ryan walked into the kitchen and lifted the lid from a cast iron pot simmering gently on the stove. Steam filled the room with the smell of herbs, potatoes, carrots, and slow-cooked vegetables. He reached into a bread box resting on the counter and removed the final loaf he had baked 3 days earlier. "It is not as fresh as I would like," he admitted while slicing generous pieces. "But it still tastes better than mining rations." Alara watched every movement. The simple familiarity of someone preparing dinner without fear or urgency seemed strangely beautiful. Ryan placed 2 bowls on the table before sitting down. He noticed she remained standing. "Is something wrong?" She looked at the empty chair across from him. "Nobody has set a place for me in a very long time." Ryan quietly pulled the chair back from the table. "Then I suppose we should not waste the opportunity." Slowly, almost uncertainly, Alara sat down. The little cabin settled into peaceful silence broken only by the gentle crackling of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against warm bowls. For the first time since leaving the auction hall, she realized she was no longer counting the distance to the nearest exit. She was listening to the sound of a home. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the small cabin windows, painting narrow bands of gold across the worn wooden floor, while the distant sound of mining drills rolled through the valley like slow thunder. Ryan had already left before dawn, just as every miner in Blackstone Colony did. The breakfast dishes had been washed and carefully stacked beside the sink. A fresh loaf of bread rested beneath a clean linen towel along with a handwritten note folded neatly beside it. Alara looked at the unfamiliar paper for several moments before picking it up. The handwriting was simple and uneven, the kind shaped more by years of holding mining tools than writing letters. It read, "There is stew on the stove. Bread beside it. If you decide to leave today, take both. If you decide to stay until supper, I will bring more potatoes home." There was no request, no condition, no expectation, only a quiet assumption that the choice belonged entirely to her. Alara folded the note again and held it gently between both hands. She had forgotten what it felt like to be trusted without first proving she deserved it. Most of the morning passed in peaceful silence. She swept the cabin floor, added another piece of wood to the fireplace, and quietly repaired a loose cabinet hinge she noticed near the kitchen sink using an old screwdriver left inside a drawer. The simple tasks calmed her in ways she did not fully understand. For the first time in years, every sound inside the little cabin belonged to ordinary life rather than survival. By late afternoon, she stepped outside carrying the empty bread basket Ryan had left near the porch. The colony looked different in daylight. Children played beside stacks of mining crates. Laundry fluttered between neighboring cabins. Elderly workers rested on shaded benches while sharing coffee before the evening shift changed. Nobody followed her. Nobody watched her every movement. She walked slowly through the narrow streets until she reached the small marketplace where fresh vegetables, work gloves, lamp oil, and simple household supplies filled the wooden stalls. An elderly woman selling herbs smiled warmly. "Good afternoon." Alara hesitated before quietly answering, "Good afternoon." The words felt surprisingly unfamiliar. The woman pointed toward the basket in Alara's hands. "Looking for bread?" Alara smiled faintly. "Not today." She looked down at the empty basket. "Today I think I am carrying it home." The elderly woman laughed softly without asking another question. As sunset colored the red cliffs beyond the colony, Ryan finally returned from the mines carrying his dented helmet beneath one arm. Fine red dust covered his jacket from shoulders to boots. He looked exhausted, yet the moment he saw smoke rising gently from his cabin chimney, his pace slowed. Someone was already home. He quietly opened the front door. The familiar smell of vegetable stew welcomed him first, then fresh bread, then something else. Warm herbs he had never purchased before. Alara stood at the kitchen counter carefully stirring another pot, while several clean vegetables rested beside a cutting board. She looked up as he entered. "I hope you do not mind," she said softly. "The market traded herbs for one of my old sewing kits." Ryan removed his dusty jacket and smiled. "Smells better than anything I was planning." She looked slightly uncertain. "I was not sure if I should cook." He set his helmet beside the door before answering. "Neither was I." She frowned with gentle confusion. Ryan looked around the little cabin where another bowl had already been placed across from his own at the table. "I was not sure if anyone would still be here when I got home." Alara rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair she had prepared for him. "I thought about leaving." Ryan nodded quietly. "I figured you might." She looked toward the open doorway where evening light spilled gently across the porch. "Then I realized something." He waited. "Nobody has ever given me the freedom to choose before." Her golden eyes met his across the little kitchen. "Today, I chose to come back." The words settled warmly inside the cabin while the first stars slowly appeared above the mining colony outside. Ryan smiled, pulled back his chair, and quietly sat down. For the second evening in a row, 2 bowls rested on the old wooden table. This time, neither of them felt borrowed. 3 quiet days passed before the past finally found its way to Blackstone Mining Colony. The mornings began the same. Ryan left before sunrise carrying his dented helmet and empty lunch tin toward the mines. Alara prepared breakfast, swept the cabin floor, and gradually learned the peaceful rhythm of ordinary life. The evenings ended with warm stew, fresh bread, and conversations that rarely lasted very long. Neither of them rushed the silence. Trust grew the way small plants pushed through stone, slowly enough that nobody noticed until it was already there. On the 4th afternoon, while Ryan worked deep beneath the western ridge repairing a damaged drilling line, an unfamiliar vibration rolled gently through the valley above. It was not the heavy shaking caused by excavation machines. This sound carried a smoother rhythm, almost musical. Workers gradually looked toward the sky as shadows crossed the red cliffs surrounding the colony. Several silver rescue transports descended through the drifting dust before settling beyond the main freight station. Their hulls bore a crest unlike any mining corporation operating in the region. 3 interlocking stars surrounded by a circle of light. Ryan noticed the emblem only briefly before the shift supervisor called everyone back to work. Yet something about the symbol stayed with him. Far above, Alara stood beside the cabin window holding a basket of washed vegetables when she heard the same engines. The basket slipped gently onto the kitchen table as she stepped outside. Her golden eyes widened the moment she recognized the crest shimmering across the nearest transport. She had not seen it in years. The rescue vessels remained motionless, while several uniformed figures quietly stepped onto the dusty landing field. None carried weapons. Instead, they moved with careful purpose, studying every face around them as though searching for someone they had almost given up hoping to find. News traveled quickly through a mining colony. By sunset, nearly everyone knew strangers had arrived, asking unusual questions. Had anyone seen a young alien woman wearing a faded gray coat? Had anyone noticed an old rescue insignia? Did anyone know where she might be staying? Ryan finished his shift shortly afterward and began the familiar walk home beneath a sky slowly turning copper beneath the setting sun. As he approached the cabin, he noticed 3 visitors waiting respectfully beside the front gate. Their uniforms matched the transports now resting near the freight station. Dust covered their boots from hours of searching. The oldest among them stepped forward the moment Ryan approached. His silver hair reflected the evening light, while years of quiet responsibility rested across his calm expression. "Mr. Ryan Mitchell?" Ryan nodded cautiously. "That is me." The older man placed one hand across the center of his chest before speaking again. "My name is Commander Solon Varek of the Interstellar Rescue Corps." Ryan immediately looked toward the cabin. Alara had quietly stepped onto the porch, frozen where she stood. The commander turned toward her. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the older man's expression softened with unmistakable relief. "Officer Lissa Varel," he said gently, "we finally found you." The words seemed to steal the remaining strength from her legs. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself, her golden eyes filling with quiet disbelief. Ryan looked between them without interrupting. Commander Varek slowly removed a weathered identification tablet from inside his uniform. The screen displayed an old photograph taken many years earlier. A younger Lissa stood smiling beside dozens of rescue workers wearing the same silver emblem, now shining across the visitors' uniforms. For 6 years, the commander continued softly. Every rescue crew in our alliance believed you were gone. Lissa lowered her eyes. So did I. The younger officer standing beside Commander Varek quietly wiped dust from a polished rescue badge before holding it toward her. Every academy still teaches the evacuation you led. Ryan looked toward Lissa in surprise. She had never spoken about any of this. The commander smiled with quiet admiration. More than 800 civilians survived because one young officer refused to leave anyone behind. He paused before looking gently toward Ryan. The only person she could not rescue was herself. Until now, the evening air remained warm long after the rescue transports settled beside the freight station. Red dust drifted gently through the valley while workers quietly gathered at a respectful distance, pretending to continue ordinary conversations even though every eye occasionally wandered toward the small cabin on the western ridge. News traveled quickly through mining settlements, but true stories always moved more slowly than rumors. Inside the cabin, Commander Solon Varek sat across the wooden table from Ryan while Lissa remained beside the window, her fingers resting lightly against the weathered frame as she looked toward the familiar lights of Blackstone Colony. For several minutes no one spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Finally, the commander placed a small metal case onto the table and opened it with careful hands. Inside rested an old rescue insignia, several preserved service records, and a folded banner bearing the crest of the Interstellar Rescue Corps. "These have been waiting for you," he said softly. Lissa looked at the insignia without reaching for it. "I do not know if I deserve to wear that again." Commander Varek gently smiled. "You never stopped deserving it." She lowered her eyes. "I was captured. After saving 800 civilians. I never came back. Because nobody came for you." The older officer's calm voice carried no judgment, only truth. Ryan quietly listened without interrupting. He understood enough to recognize that some wounds had nothing to do with chains. Commander Varek slowly unfolded another document across the table. It contained dozens of signatures written in different languages. Every survivor from the evacuation signed this. Lissa looked at the page in disbelief. "What is it? A petition?" She frowned gently. "For what?" "To keep searching." Her breathing became unsteady. The commander continued quietly. "Every year they asked the council to continue the search." He looked toward her with unmistakable warmth. "No one forgot you." A single tear slipped quietly down Lissa's cheek. She had spent years believing she had disappeared from every memory except her own. Ryan looked toward the window, giving her the privacy to feel what words could not describe. Outside, children laughed somewhere beyond the neighboring cabins while evening lamps slowly illuminated the narrow streets. Life continued peacefully, unaware that one lonely heart had just found its way home. After a long silence, Commander Varek carefully closed the metal case. "Our transport leaves tomorrow morning." Lissa nodded slowly. "I understand. The Corps would be honored to welcome you back." She looked toward Ryan before answering. "May I think about it tonight?" "Of course." The commander stood and respectfully placed one hand across his chest before leaving the cabin with the other officers. Their footsteps gradually faded into the evening until only the crackling fireplace remained. Ryan quietly poured 2 cups of warm tea before setting one beside Lissa without saying anything. She wrapped both hands around the mug, watching the steam rise gently toward the ceiling. "They came for me," she whispered. Ryan nodded. "They did." She smiled through quiet tears. "For years I believed nobody remembered." Ryan looked toward the rescue transports glowing softly beneath the stars. "Looks like they never stopped." Another silence settled between them, warmer now than before. Finally, Lissa asked the question that had quietly followed her since the commander arrived. "If I leave tomorrow?" She hesitated. "Will you think I am ungrateful?" Ryan looked at her with calm certainty. "No." She searched his face. "Why?" He smiled gently. "Because freedom means choosing your own road." He glanced toward the open doorway where cool evening air drifted inside. "If I rescued you only so you would stay, then I never really set you free." Lissa lowered her eyes toward the warm tea resting in her hands. Slowly, the fear that had once filled every tomorrow began giving way to something she had almost forgotten. Choice. And for the first time since stepping onto the auction platform, tomorrow no longer frightened her because, whatever path she chose when the sun returned, it would finally belong to her. Sunrise arrived quietly over Blackstone Mining Colony, painting the red cliffs with gentle gold while the rescue transports prepared for departure beneath a clear desert sky. Workers paused along the roads to watch the silver vessels warming their engines, their polished hulls reflecting the first light of morning across the settlement. Ryan stood outside the little cabin holding a mug of coffee that had already grown cold in his hands. He watched the transports without trying to guess what choice Lissa would make. He had promised her freedom, and freedom meant accepting whatever tomorrow looked like. The cabin door opened softly behind him. Lissa stepped onto the porch wearing the same gray travel coat, though the rescue insignia now rested neatly over her heart once again. The old uncertainty had disappeared from her golden eyes. In its place remained something quieter. Peace. She stood beside Ryan without speaking while the warm desert wind carried the scent of red dust and distant fields across the valley. Finally, she smiled gently. I made my decision. Ryan nodded once. I figured you would. She looked toward the waiting rescue ships. I am going with them. Ryan smiled. Good. She turned toward him with mild surprise. You are not disappointed? He shook his head. No, not even a little. He looked toward the horizon where the sun continued climbing above the mountains. Someone once told me nobody should have to earn the right to be free. She recognized the words immediately. He had simply given them back to her. A soft laugh escaped before tears quietly followed. You remembered. The important things usually stay. A few minutes later they walked together toward the landing field where Commander Solon Varek and the rescue crews waited patiently beside the transport ramp. Several miners removed their helmets as Lissa approached. Others quietly nodded with genuine respect. Somehow the entire colony understood that someone who had once arrived in chains was leaving under her own choice. Commander Varek greeted her warmly before turning toward Ryan. The Corps owes you a debt beyond measure. Ryan smiled faintly. You do not owe me anything. The commander reached into his coat and carefully unfolded a formal document bearing the official seal of the Interstellar Rescue Corps. Then allow us one promise instead. Ryan accepted the paper without reading it. What kind of promise? No rescue vessel under our command will ever again participate in a transaction where freedom is treated as property. Ryan looked at the commander quietly. That single sentence mattered more than money ever could. Lissa stepped closer before removing the old release certificate Ryan had placed into her hands inside the auction hall. She had folded it carefully enough that the paper still looked almost new. I kept this, she whispered. Ryan smiled. I hoped you would. She placed the document inside a small glass frame the rescue crew had prepared. Beneath it rested the broken blue restraint that had once circled her wrist, now powerless and harmless. At the bottom of the frame, a simple engraved plate carried only 7 words. Freedom is never an item for sale. Years later, travelers passing through Blackstone Mining Colony often stopped inside the old exchange hall, though nobody recognized it anymore. The auction platform had disappeared. In its place stood a bright rescue center where stranded workers, lost travelers, and hungry families found warm meals, clean beds, and people willing to help without asking what anyone could offer in return. Near the entrance, behind clear glass, the framed release certificate and broken restraint remained on display. Every visitor eventually paused to read the small inscription beneath them. Ryan still worked in the mines each morning. He still lived inside the same modest cabin on the western ridge. Lissa visited often between rescue missions, sometimes staying only one evening, sometimes several weeks. Whenever she arrived, the first place she always walked was the little wooden porch where one ordinary miner had once looked at a frightened stranger and chosen compassion instead of ownership. Neither of them ever spoke much about that day anymore. They no longer needed to. The chains had long since become nothing more than silent metal behind glass. The freedom they represented continued walking through the world one quiet act of kindness at a time. And in a universe where too many people believed everything carried a price, 2 ordinary souls quietly proved that the most valuable gift anyone could ever give another person was the chance to choose their own tomorrow.